The plague did not arrive all at once. It crept in, quiet as a shadow, drifting across oceans, slipping through ports, moving along trade routes like a silent passenger. But by the time it reached the unnamed European city where our plague doctor lived, it arrived with unmistakable force, like a storm that had been gathering for months. At first, the city refused to believe. People insisted that the strange swellings appearing on bodies were nothing more than bad air, a passing fever, or the result of late summer heat. But then the rats appeared, crawling from granaries, from between stones in the streets, from beneath tavern doorways. And behind them came the fleas. Within weeks, a city that once woke to the sounds of laughter, market stalls, and church bells instead woke to silence. The plague doctor entered this silence each morning. He would step out into deserted streets, the sky dimmed by a veil of smoke from fires meant to purify the air. The buildings around him were tall, close, leaning inward like eavesdropping giants. Their windows were dark. Their doorways were sealed with painted symbols warning others not to enter. No carts rolled. No merchants shouted prices. No church bells called the faithful to prayer, only tolled for the dead. Every sound echoed. Every breath felt heavier. Even the birds avoided the city center, as though sensing an invisible poison in the air. The city in which our doctor worked had once been vibrant. There had been festivals in the square, vendors selling spices, bakers ringing bells near dawn, and children playing along the riverside. But now the river itself seemed somber, flowing slower, its banks deserted. Bodies, wrapped in cloth, sometimes floated against its edges before being collected by men who worked with long poles to keep themselves at a distance. The doctor's daily route took him past the marketplace, once a lively center of commerce, now an empty grid of abandoned wooden stalls. Cloth fluttered in the breeze where merchants had left in a hurry, some leaving their goods behind. The scent of spices had long faded, replaced by the acrid smell of smoke and the heavy odor of illness. He always paused here, not for medical reasons, but out of memory. He remembered treating children who used to run between the stalls. He remembered an old spice seller who gave him cinnamon bark to chew when he was young. That man's stall now stood empty, the wooden shutters cracked and slumping. As the doctor walked, the only movement often came from shadows behind shuttered windows. Families watched him pass, fearful to call out, but desperate for help. Some would slip notes under their doors, begging him to visit, to bring herbs, to check on a dying child. The city, though silent, pulsed with suffering. He often found dead animals lying in the streets, dogs, cats, forgotten horses. People believed animals carried the sickness, so many were killed. Ironically, the very creatures that could have slowed the rat population were gone, and the plague spread faster. The quiet was broken only occasionally by the wheels of the dead cart. Covered in black cloth and drawn by a slow-moving horse, it made its way through the streets, with two men following behind. Their faces were wrapped. Their hands were gloved. They banged on doors 3 times, slow, heavy knocks that echoed like distant thunder. If no one answered, they went inside, dragging out bodies. The doctor had seen this so many times that the rhythm of the knocks sometimes echoed in his dreams. And yet, despite the horror, he felt something most would never expect: a profound stillness. Not peace exactly, but a strange clarity. The noise of everyday life had evaporated, leaving behind the bare structure of existence. Life and death, sickness and hope, fear and courage, these things stood starkly before him, unsoftened by distraction. He would stop sometimes on a high street where the wind blew through abandoned shutters, lifting dust into the air. He would stand still, listening to the faint sighs of wind, the distant crackle of purifying fires, and the soft creak of wooden beams settling. These sounds were subtle reminders that the world still moved, even if the people within it faltered. Above him, the sky often seemed strangely bright, as though the world beyond the plague tried to offer calm where none existed on the ground. Clouds drifted lazily. Sunlight filtered between buildings. Birds circled far overhead, careful not to land. It was in this city, a place emptied, fearful, but still holding on to remnants of beauty, that our plague doctor worked. With each step he took, his boots scraping against cobblestone, he carried not only tools and herbs, but also the weight of countless unanswerable questions. Why was the plague spreading so fast? What caused it? How could it be stopped? Why did some survive while others died within hours? These questions drove him deeper into the city's silence, into the homes of the suffering, and into the pages of his own journals, where each observation was recorded with care. Section 2. The Making of a Plague Doctor, Training, Fear, and First Lessons. Long before he became a wandering figure in a bird-like mask, our plague doctor had been simply a young man with ink-stained fingers, a stack of heavy medical texts, and a quiet determination to understand the human body. His training began years before the Black Death arrived, in a modest university surrounded by stone walls and ivy. Back then, medicine was a discipline caught halfway between ancient superstition and the first flickers of rational science. Students studied anatomy from old texts rather than human bodies. Dissections were rare, considered disturbing, even sinful, and permitted only under the strictest circumstances. Still, he studied intensely. He read Galen, Hippocrates, Avicenna. He learned how the ancients believed that the body was governed by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that illness arose from their imbalance. He memorized diagrams of the human body that were more symbolic than accurate. He practiced diagnosis by examining the color of a patient's skin, the scent of their breath, the texture of their pulse. But buried within his academic discipline, he also possessed something unusual, a deep desire to observe reality, not just recite old teachings. He took notes on real symptoms he saw during small outbreaks of fever. He sketched plants and annotated them with the effects they had on those who consumed them. He wrote questions to himself in the margins of his books, questions that many of his professors would have dismissed. He wanted to understand how illness spread, why one household fell sick while a neighboring one remained untouched, why some wounds festered while others healed cleanly. He was curious in a way that did not fit neatly into the medical traditions of his time. When news of a terrible pestilence spreading across distant lands reached the university, most students reacted with fear. Some dismissed the reports as exaggeration. Others prayed. A few considered fleeing to remote towns where disease traveled more slowly. But he listened intently, not because he wished to face the plague, but because he sensed, deep within himself, that this strange illness represented a mystery that demanded to be understood. Something unprecedented was coming. When he finished his studies, he returned to his city, taking a small post as a physician's apprentice. He spent his earliest years treating fevers, broken bones, coughs, and injuries caused by the daily life of a bustling medieval town. He worked long hours. He visited the poor as often as the wealthy, sometimes receiving payment, sometimes receiving nothing. He listened more than he spoke. And then, one morning, the news arrived officially. A ship had docked at a coastal port, only a few days' ride from the city, and its crew was mostly dead. The survivors were covered in swellings, coughing blood, burning with fever. The port sealed itself, but it was too late. The sickness was already loose. Panic spread faster than the plague itself. The city council called for a plague doctor, someone who would serve the city, isolate the sick, record symptoms, administer herbs, and attempt treatments. Most local physicians refused. They had families, estates, reputations to protect. Some fled that very night. But he stepped forward, not because he felt brave, not because he felt invincible, but because something inside him whispered that he might be able to understand this illness more clearly than others. And because leaving his city, the people he'd treated for years felt like a betrayal. The council agreed. And so he began his strange transformation from ordinary physician to plague doctor. His uniform was prepared. First, the robe, made of heavy fabric coated with wax and oils. It was meant to prevent the pestilential air from clinging to him. Then the wide-brimmed hat, a sign of his medical profession. Then the gloves, the boots, the cane. And finally, the mask. When he first held it, he was surprised by its weight. The long beak, curved and hollow, seemed more like something from a carnival than a tool of healing. But the mask was not for show. In the beak, he packed herbs: rosemary, lavender, mint, cloves, juniper, and sometimes vinegar-soaked sponges. These were believed to cleanse the air before it reached his lungs. The glass lenses over the eyes distorted his vision, making the world appear warped, slightly distant, as though he were walking through a dream. He practiced wearing the mask in his small home, pacing back and forth, adjusting to the narrow view and shallow breathing. While the mask was meant to protect him, it also isolated him, making every breath feel like it came from far away. When the plague finally entered the city, he was among the first to witness its cruelty. He visited a family whose eldest son had developed swellings beneath his arms. He watched as the boy's fever rose rapidly. He noted the dark blotches forming on the skin. People called them. He observed how quickly the illness progressed, how unpredictable it was, how little the traditional treatments helped. He tried everything he had been taught: bleeding, herbal poultices, burning aromatic branches in sick rooms, applying balms of myrrh, sage, and pine resin, placing hot irons near buboes to draw out the poison. None of it stopped the plague's advance. He felt frustration, fear, and an unbearable sense of responsibility. He was supposed to help, yet the illness seemed to mock every ounce of knowledge he possessed. Still, he refused to give up. He began to write daily observations. He recorded the timing of symptoms. He tracked which streets were hit first. He spoke with survivors, noting every detail of their recovery. He tried to identify patterns: weather changes, household conditions, proximity to marketplaces. He even attempted to map how the sickness moved from one neighborhood to another. People feared him, but they also relied on him. His masked figure became a symbol of both dread and fragile hope. Children hid behind their mothers when he passed. Adults whispered prayers. Some left food near his door, unsure whether he could safely eat with bare hands. His own family begged him to stop. But he continued, not because he believed he could cure the plague, though he hoped he might, but because he felt that someone needed to witness it, document it, attempt to understand it. He believed the knowledge he gathered might one day help future generations, even if it could not save those dying before him. In the quiet moments of dawn, when he walked through the deserted city, he sometimes wondered whether the mask had changed him, whether wearing the face of a bird had made him feel detached, less human, or perhaps more aware of the fragile divide between life and death. He did not know then that his journals would survive long after the plague ended. He only knew that he had chosen a path that few dared to follow, and he would walk it until the very last door in the city had been knocked upon. Section 2. The city that lived in fear. When the plague doctor first arrived, the city did not greet him with words, nor with ceremony, nor even with inquiry. Instead, it greeted him with silence, a heavy, swollen quietness that clung to the air like cobwebs left unbroken. Houses were shuttered, even in daylight. Windows were cracked open only enough for an unseen hand to lower a basket tied to a rope. Every sound felt distant. Even the birds had abandoned the rooftops, as if they sensed that the ground below them no longer belonged to life. The doctor walked through this quiet world slowly, his steps echoing on the narrow cobblestone streets. His boots carried dust from earlier towns that had already lost their battles. But he did not let the memory of those places cloud his eyes. Every new city, he told himself, deserved hope, even if it arrived wearing a beaked mask and a heavy coat. The city he had entered was ringed by high, uneven stone walls, built long before the plague existed. Perhaps, once upon a time, they were meant to keep out invading armies. Now they kept the citizens inside, like frightened creatures huddled in a fortress that was losing its purpose. Near the gates, carts filled with bundles of cloth and straw sat unattended. Only after a moment's closeness did the doctor realize that they were not bundles at all. They were bodies, waiting for someone brave enough or desperate enough to bury them. He paused for a moment, resting his gloved hand on the edge of one cart. The face of the nearest victim was covered, but underneath the linen, the outline of swollen glands was visible, rising like stones pressed beneath the skin. In another life, this person might have been a baker or a blacksmith, or a child learning letters for the first time. But the plague erased professions, ages, destinies. It left only a single, terrible sameness. The doctor bowed his head, not out of grief alone, but out of respect. He believed that remembering the humanity of the dead brought strength to the living. It reminded him why he marched into danger instead of away from it. He continued deeper into the city. The air inside the walls was thick and warm, despite the season. Fires burned constantly in the hearths of those who remained indoors. People believed that bad smells carried illness, so they filled their homes with perfumes, herbs, burning oils, even hot coals meant to cleanse the air. Instead, the heat trapped the odors of sickness and fear together, creating a heavy mixture that seeped through every alley. Shutters clattered above him as he passed. Sometimes a face appeared for only a moment, pale, anxious, with dark rings under the eyes, before vanishing again. People did not want to be seen, and they especially did not want to see him. The mask made him appear like a creature from another world, a figure drifting in from some border between life and death. Some whispered that plague doctors brought the disease rather than curing it. Others believed they could steal the souls of the dying. Still, others feared the simple reminder that they themselves might soon need him. But the doctor never resented their fear. He understood that it came from pain, not hatred. Eventually, he found the central square, the heart of the silent city. It was once a marketplace, now transformed into a gathering point only for the truly desperate. Here, instead of vendors shouting or children running, there was a single man ringing a bell with an unsteady hand. The bell had once marked celebrations and feast days. Now its sound meant only one thing. Another home had lost its battle. A small crowd approached the bell ringer. They kept their distance from one another, and all wore cloths wrapped around their faces. They whispered quickly, with glances darting toward their own houses, as if speaking for too long invited disaster. When the doctor arrived, they fell silent and parted, forming a cautious path for him. Some bowed their heads. Others backed away entirely. The bell ringer, a thin, trembling man whose eyes were red not from illness but exhaustion, stopped ringing and pointed toward a narrow street to the west. "It is worse there," he said, voice cracking. 3 houses in one night, children in 2 of them. The doctor nodded, absorbing the information like a stone absorbs sunlight, quietly, without complaint. He did not promise healing. He never made promises at all. Instead, he offered presence, which in times like this was sometimes more valuable than any cure. He walked toward the afflicted street, passing through doorways marked with crude symbols. Some homes bore chalk crosses. Others displayed bunches of herbs tied to the wood. One had a single wilted rose hung upside down, an old custom meant to ward off unhappy spirits. The doctor observed every detail, not to judge, but to understand. The way people protect themselves, he believed, reveals the truth of their suffering. When he reached the first house, he tapped the wooden door lightly with his staff. From inside came a faint, wavering voice. "You may enter." The door opened a crack. A woman stood on the other side, eyes swollen with worry, her hands wrapped in cloth. She stepped back, letting the doctor through. Inside, the air was warm and perfumed with rosemary. The doctor recognized the scent instantly. It was traditional for families to burn rosemary to fight the plague. But beneath the fragrance was the unmistakable odor of fever, sharp, metallic, and painfully human. The woman led him to a small back room where two children lay side by side on thin mattresses. A candle flickered beside them, casting trembling shadows across their faces. Both children were awake but drained. Their breaths were shallow, their cheeks flushed with heat. The doctor knelt beside them. He did not remove his mask. It was not simply for protection, but a symbol of calm, a barrier that helped families feel that fear need not overwhelm them. With gentle, deliberate movements, he examined the children's pulses, their glands, their eyes. He murmured soft words of reassurance, even though the children barely understood him. To the mother, he spoke more clearly: what herbs to boil, what linens to change, how to keep the fever from rising too fast. He handed her a small packet of crushed leaves, an aromatic mixture to ease breathing, and a scrap of parchment with his instructions written in looping, careful script. When he stood to leave, the mother's voice broke. "Will they?" He paused, turning toward her. His answer was steady. "I cannot promise outcomes, but I promise care, and I promise that you are not alone." The woman lowered her head, tears falling silently onto her hands. Outside, the doctor walked toward the next house on the street, the next symbol etched on a door. The city still lay in silence around him, but within that silence, something had changed. A presence had arrived, steady, patient, and unafraid. And though the plague was everywhere, hope now walked beside it. Section 3. The Mask, the Hat, and the Tools of Hope. To most people, the plague doctor looked like a creature summoned from a dream, a tall figure wrapped in darkness, crowned with a wide-brimmed hat and staring through glass lenses set into a long, curved beak. Children who glimpsed him through slits in their shutters whispered that he was a walking omen. Adults called him a necessary shadow, but very few knew that every piece of his strange attire existed not for fear, but for protection, and even more importantly, for comfort. In an age when the cause of the plague was still a mystery, the doctor's clothing was the closest thing anyone had to armor. And though much of it was based on the flawed beliefs of the time, it represented an important truth. People were trying. They were trying to understand, to defend themselves, to survive. And so was he. The doctor's hat, wide and stiff, was the easiest part to explain. It marked him instantly as a physician, even if he rarely spoke of titles or training. In dim alleyways where torches flickered and smoke gathered, the hat served as a sign, a reminder that someone still walked the streets with purpose when others hid behind locked doors. People recognized it even before they recognized the beak. But the beak was what they feared most. Long, curved, and eerily bird-like, it gave the doctor an almost otherworldly appearance. Yet inside the beak was a mixture of herbs, spices, and dried flowers. Rosemary, lavender, mint, cloves, camphor, each chosen for its powerful scent. The belief of the age was that disease traveled through bad air, foul vapors that drifted invisibly through the streets. To protect themselves, doctors filled their masks with good scents, hoping to filter the air before it reached their lungs. And although science would one day prove this method ineffective, the mask offered something else, something equally valuable. It gave the doctor courage. The herbs, packed into the beak, filled his mask with familiar, grounding smells. In rooms where death lingered thickly in the air, where the breath of the sick came fast and hot and uneven, the calming fragrance allowed him to stay focused. Every inhale reminded him that he was there to guide, not to fear. His heart remained steady behind the scent of mint and rosemary. His gloves, made of thick leather, protected his hands not only from contact with the sick, but from the emotional weight of touch. When he examined a patient's swollen glands or trembling limbs, the barrier softened the feeling, not to create distance, but to prevent his empathy from overwhelming him. He needed his hands to remain strong. He needed his mind to stay clear. Next came his coat, long and waxed with oils until it repelled water and dirt. It hung from his shoulders like a heavy shadow. When he walked, it whispered across the stones with every step. Underneath it, he wore additional layers of cloth, wrapped tightly as if bracing against an unseen wind. These layers did not shield him from the plague, but they shielded him from despair, forming a cocoon of fabric between himself and the world collapsing around him. At his side, he carried tools. Some were simple, others mysterious, and all of them held stories. The wooden cane was the most recognizable. He used it to examine patients from a distance, lifting blankets, pointing to rashes, testing movement. But the cane had another purpose, one he rarely admitted aloud. When he walked through darkened rooms or narrow alleys, he tapped the ground gently. The rhythm steadied him. It reminded him he was still present, still grounded, still human. He carried small vials of herbs and oils, each carefully labeled. Some were meant to reduce fever, others to ease breathing, others to create scented smoke. None of them cured the plague, but all of them soothed symptoms. They bought patients time. And sometimes in a world ruled by chance, a little time was all a person needed to survive. He also kept a ledger, a small book bound in worn leather, filled with his observations, symptoms, patterns, notes about neighborhoods where the disease spread faster, records of the treatments he tried. He believed that knowledge itself was a form of medicine, one that grew stronger with every page he wrote. Late at night, in borrowed candlelight, he traced each sentence twice to make sure it was clear. If future doctors found his ledger, he wanted it to help them, even if he no longer lived to see their success. But among all his tools, there was one item he valued above the rest, a simple white cloth folded neatly inside his coat. It was not for medical use, nor for protection, nor for ritual. Instead, he used it for moments when families cried in front of him, when grief spilled faster than words could soothe. He offered the cloth gently, not to stop tears, but to hold them with dignity. Over time, the cloth carried the weight of many sorrows, yet the doctor washed it carefully and kept it close. It reminded him that his work was not about fighting disease alone. It was about witnessing humanity. As he walked through the city with all these tools, the mask, the herbs, the cane, the ledger, the cloth, he appeared strange to those who watched from windows. But inside, he was simply a man assembling any shield he could find against the overwhelming tide of suffering. To some, he looked like a frightening omen. To others, like a wandering spirit. But to those who truly understood, those whose loved ones lay feverish in darkened rooms, he was something else entirely. He was hope wearing strange clothing, a silhouette moving through empty streets, a reminder that even when a city was drowning in fear, someone was still walking, still knocking on doors, still bending over the sick with steady hands. The plague doctor's tools were not magical. They were not enough to stop the Black Death, but they were enough to keep him going. And sometimes that was the most powerful medicine of all. Section 4. Entering the houses of the dying. Every city touched by the Black Death developed its own silence. Not the peaceful silence of nightfall or snowfall, but a dense, uneasy quiet. A quiet that seems to watch you, to listen to your breath. The plague doctor felt this silence every time he stepped into a new street, every time he raised his hand to knock on a door. It wrapped around him like fog. It slowed time. And yet, he walked into it willingly. The houses of the sick were nothing alike on the outside. Some were wealthy homes with carved wooden beams and wide windows. Others were tiny, half-collapsed dwellings wedged between shops and workshops. But once he stepped inside, every house shared the same air, thick with heat, worry, and the faint smell of illness. Entering them was an act of courage, but also an act of gentleness. He never barged in. He never hurried. He knocked softly, paused, then entered as if stepping into a sacred space. The first thing he always noticed was the light. In most homes, it was dim. Windows were covered with cloth to keep out flies, and sometimes to hide fear from the neighbors. Candles flickered in far corners, casting small pools of yellow glow. The doctor allowed his eyes to adjust before moving deeper. He did not want to startle the sick. In those rooms, sudden movements felt like thunder. The next thing he noticed was the sound of breathing. Not the steady, quiet breathing of sleep, but short, fast, uneven breaths. Sometimes the patient wheezed, sometimes they moaned softly. Sometimes they said nothing at all, just the faint rise and fall of a chest that struggled with each moment. The doctor often found that the sound of breathing told him more than any words could. It whispered the truth of the body, long before symptoms became obvious. He would approach the patient slowly, the tap of his cane announcing his arrival. He wanted them to know someone was there. Not death, not darkness, but another human being who had come to help. Many patients tried to sit up when they saw him. He would raise his hand gently and motion for them to rest. He knew that every movement cost them precious strength. Before he examined them, he always asked for a story. Not a medical story. He could observe symptoms for himself, but a life story. How long they had been sick, what they remembered from the days before, who they lived with, what frightened them most. In these quiet conversations, he learned more about the human spirit than any book could have taught him. The stories helped him understand not only the body, but the heart. Sometimes patients were children, curled beneath blankets too large for them. He approached them with the softest voice he could manage, crouching beside them so they would not feel overshadowed. He held out his gloved hand, palm open, so they could see he carried nothing frightening. Children often stared at his mask before anything else, the curved beak, the glass lenses. He explained in simple words that the mask was there to protect him, so he could stay with them longer. Most children, oddly, seemed comforted by that. Adults reacted differently. Some were relieved to see him. Others were afraid. In the plague years, rumors spread as fast as disease. Rumors that plague doctors marked people for death, or brought plague with them, or worked for dark forces. He never blamed people for their fear. Fear was the heaviest presence in those homes, heavier than sickness, heavier than despair. So he never rushed. He would light a small stick of aromatic herbs and let it smoke gently in the corner of the room. The scent, warm, sharp, and clean, softened the tension in the air. It calmed the families as much as it calmed him. A visiting doctor who moved slowly, who lit calming herbs, who spoke softly. These details mattered. They made people feel cared for instead of abandoned. Then came the examination. Not with needles, not with harsh instruments, but with careful observation. He looked at the swelling of the lymph nodes. He checked the patient's temperature by placing the back of his glove near their forehead. He watched how they shifted, how they held their chest, how their eyes reacted to light. He listened not only with his ears, but with intuition shaped by dozens of sad, quiet visits before this one. He knew the signs too well. The trembling hands that refused to warm, the rashes that spread like darkened constellations across the skin, the coughing that tightened the whole body. Yet even when he recognized the worst signs, he never let his voice betray it. He spoke with steadiness. He explained what he could do. He told them what herbs might ease the pain, what foods to avoid, what rituals of care could bring a small measure of relief. Families often begged him for a cure, a miracle, a promise. He never lied, but he never left them without comfort. "I will do everything I can," he always said. "You are not alone." Those words mattered more than any medicine. In many houses, after he finished his examination, he would kneel beside the patient and hold their hand. Not bare, but through leather, a barrier against fear as much as disease. He did not grip tightly. He simply allowed the patient to feel the presence of another human being in a moment of deep loneliness. Some would whisper their last hope. Some would ask for water. Some would simply breathe a little more calmly. When he rose to leave, he always left something behind: a small pouch of herbs, a written note of care instructions, or sometimes only a blessing. He closed the door softly behind him, never allowing it to slam. A slammed door felt like a verdict. A gently closed one felt like respect. And then he stepped back into the empty street, into the wind that carried both fresh air and sorrow. The mask filtered the scents. The hat cast a shadow over his eyes. But nothing shielded his heart fully. Still he continued, house after house, day after day, because entering the homes of the dying was not simply a duty. It was a promise to the living. Section 5. The Tools of Hope. Inside a plague doctor's medical kit. A plague doctor's bag was not large. It did not need to be. In those days, medical knowledge was more art than science, more intuition than certainty, and every object he carried had a meaning far deeper than its appearance. The bag swung gently at his side as he walked from house to house, a soft, rhythmic reminder that even in a world filled with fear, he still carried tools meant for healing. When he opened his medical kit, he did so with the same quiet care he used when entering a patient's home. The wooden lid creaked softly, the hinges worn from years of use. Inside lay objects arranged with almost ceremonial order, each placed deliberately, as if the slightest misalignment would disrupt the fragile balance between life and death. These were not the tools of a surgeon working in a bright room with assistants. These were the simple, humble instruments of a man trying to save lives in the darkest time Europe had ever known. The first object he often reached for was his herb satchel. It was a cloth pouch tied with cord, filled with a mixture of lavender, sage, thyme, rosemary, and occasionally mint. These herbs were believed to purify the air, but more importantly, they calmed the frightened. Their scent filled rooms with something gentle, something familiar, in a world that smelled of illness and decay. The aroma of herbs was a reminder that the world still held fragments of beauty. He never underestimated the power of comfort. A calm patient breathed more easily, listened more clearly, and fought more willingly. Even if the herbs did not cure the plague, something he knew in his heart, they soothed minds and strengthened spirits. And sometimes, a strengthened spirit was its own medicine. Next in the kit was a small bronze mortar and pestle, worn smooth from years of grinding. In it, he mashed dried plants into powders for poultices or teas. The sound of the pestle, soft, steady, rhythmic, helped him think. It was the sound of preparation, of purpose. When families heard it, many found reassurance in the idea that the doctor was creating something just for their loved one. His writings, tucked carefully beneath the herb satchel, were another essential part of his kit. Small parchment sheets, folded twice, filled with notes on symptoms, treatments, and observations. He wrote constantly, not because he expected to solve the mystery of the plague, but because writing allowed him to preserve patterns. He noticed things others overlooked: changes in fever cycles, differences between villages, the effects of weather. His notes held the earliest form of data, though he would not have called it that. To him, they were simply pieces of a puzzle he refused to stop trying to solve. Then there were the protective items, the objects that helped him maintain a fragile barrier between himself and a disease that had ended millions of lives. Extra gloves, coated in wax so that moisture would roll off. A small flask of vinegar for disinfecting his hands between visits. Thin wooden sticks used to lift linens or examine skin without direct contact. Simple objects, but invaluable. In a side pocket of the bag lay a collection of tiny vials, each containing different liquids. Some held herbal tinctures, wormwood for calming nausea, chamomile for easing sleep, elderflower for relieving fevers. Others held simple mixtures, such as vinegar, honey water, or wine. Even if their effects were limited, they offered a sense of action, of doing something rather than merely watching. One vial, however, he rarely used, though he always carried it. Myrrh oil. Thick, dark, and potent, it was believed to have protective properties. He used it only when the air in a patient's room felt especially heavy, when he sensed the invisible presence of something that unsettled even him. He placed a few drops on the edges of his mask's beak, letting its resinous scent strengthen the herbal mixture already within. It did not protect him in a medical sense, but it steadied his nerves. There was also a set of simple tools for treating wounds: small knives, strips of linen for bandaging, and needles for closing cuts. Though the plague rarely involved external injuries, he treated whatever he found. A small wound left unattended could become infected, and caring for the whole patient, not just the plague, made families feel seen and valued. One of the most unusual items in the kit was a long wooden cane, which he used not only to guide his steps, but to gently move bedding or clothing when examining a patient. It served as an extension of his arm, a way to interact without placing himself too close to areas where infection might linger. The cane tapped rhythmically on cobblestones as he walked, announcing his presence before he arrived. Many people recognized that sound and came to associate it with help, not fear. At the very bottom of the bag, beneath everything else, was something personal: a small, leather-bound notebook. It contained reflections, not observations. Thoughts he could not share with anyone, words he needed to release in order to continue his work. It was filled with quiet grief, with fears he could not voice, and with the rare moments of hope he discovered along the way. He did not read it often, but knowing it was there, waiting, gave him strength. Beyond physical tools, his bag carried something invisible yet powerful. It carried the weight of intention. Every object inside represented a promise: to try, to care, to stay present. Families saw that when he opened the bag. They saw a man prepared not only to diagnose, but to stand with them in the darkest hours. In a world where life felt fragile and unpredictable, that promise mattered deeply. Sometimes, when he left a patient's home late at night, he would pause in the street and place his hand on the top of the bag. He could feel every item inside, shifting softly with movement. He could smell faint traces of herbs, even through the thick leather. It reminded him that he was not empty-handed, not spiritually, not practically. His tools might not have been powerful in the modern sense, but they were tokens of compassion, symbols of effort, and instruments of dignity. And in the shadow of the Black Death, those things were as precious as miracles. Section 6. The Mask, the Myth, and the Mind. Why plague doctors looked the way they did. The plague doctor's mask has become one of history's most haunting images. Long-beaked, hollow-eyed, strange, and almost bird-like. But to the doctor himself, the mask was not a symbol of fear. It was, instead, a quiet reassurance, a protective shell he stepped into each morning before venturing into the suffering streets. It was like putting on a second face, one that could endure what his human self could not. Before stepping outside, he would lay out each piece of his attire with deliberate care. He handled them like sacred objects, because in a sense, they were. Every item, from the boots to the mask, was part of a larger idea: that sickness traveled through bad air, and that one must filter, block, and shield against it. The theory was imperfect, but it was the best the medical world had at the time. He began with the long, wax-coated robe, made of heavy fabric treated with oils to repel moisture. When he slipped it over his body, it felt like donning armor. The material scratched slightly at his skin, but he took comfort in the weight of it. It was thick enough to create distance between himself and the world, an extra layer between life and danger. Next came the boots, also waxed and sealed. He pulled them over his legs, then examined the seams to make sure nothing had cracked in the night. He had repaired them countless times. In the muddy, infected streets, a broken boot could mean a lapse in protection, and he could not afford such a lapse. The plague had no mercy for those who hesitated. He then drew on long gloves, usually made of smooth leather. They extended past his elbows, leaving no skin exposed. The gloves creaked softly as he flexed his fingers, testing their strength. Once on, they transformed his hands into something impersonal. He could touch linens, tools, and herbs, but no warm human skin. And that barrier, both physical and emotional, was essential. The belt came next. It cinched the robe around his waist, holding everything in place. Attached to it were small loops and pockets for tools, herbs, and viands, objects he would need quickly in moments of urgency. The belt made him feel organized, anchored. It turned his robe from fabric into uniform. But the most important moment came when he lifted the mask. He always hesitated for a breath before putting it on. The mask represented a kind of transformation. The moment it covered his face, he ceased to be an ordinary man moving through an ordinary world. He became a figure meant to move through suffering without faltering. A witness, a guardian, a vessel of whatever knowledge he could offer. He held the mask by its edges, careful not to disturb the herbs stuffed inside the long beak. The mixture varied day by day. Lavender, mint, rose petals, cloves, rosemary, sometimes citrus peel when he could find it. On rare occasions, he received exotic ingredients like cinnamon or camphor. He blended them not merely for supposed medical protection, but also for emotional steadiness. The scent kept him grounded. It reminded him of life, of gardens, of kitchens, of the world outside the plague's shadow. As he lifted the mask to his face, the world seemed to pause, the leather pressed against his cheeks. The straps tightened behind his head, and the eye openings framed his vision in two small circles. The edges softened everything he saw, adding a faint tunnel-like effect. It changed how distance felt, how movement appeared. Even sound became muffled, as if the mask created a private chamber of air around him. Breathing inside it was warm and rhythmic. Each inhale passed through the herbs, drawing their fragrance into his lungs. Each exhale fogged slightly against the interior. The sensation was strange at first, like breathing through a garden, but over time it became familiar, comforting, a reminder that he carried his own little world of clean air wherever he went. When he looked into a mirror while wearing the mask, he sometimes did not fully recognize himself. He saw instead a silhouette, a symbol, a walking message to the citizens. Help is coming, even in this moment of dread. Yet he also knew the mask frightened people. Children hid behind their mothers. Elderly women crossed themselves. Even grown men stepped back when he approached. The mask's appearance was not accidental. It created distance, and sometimes distance was necessary. Fear, oddly enough, protected him. People avoided coming too close. But some did find comfort in his strange appearance. They saw the mask not as a sign of death, but as a sign that someone had willingly stepped into danger for their sake. They understood that he could remove it when he returned home. He chose to wear it only for them. Beyond its symbolic nature, the mask was also a psychological shield. It allowed him to move through tragic scenes without overwhelming emotional exposure. He could hide his expressions, his grief, his moments of uncertainty. Behind the mask, he felt steadier, more capable. The family members he visited often sensed that stability, even if they could not see his face. This emotional buffer was crucial. Without it, the weight of helplessness might have crushed him. With it, he could continue day after day, offering calm guidance even when he felt sadness pressing at the edges of his thoughts. Historically, some believe the mask itself held magical protection. Others thought it was a symbol of divine authority. But for the doctor wearing it, the mask was neither magical nor divine. It was simply a tool, a barrier he hoped was enough. And in its own way, it was enough. Not because it stopped the plague completely, but because it gave him the courage to walk into homes filled with fear. Courage, after all, was not the absence of fear. It was the decision to move forward despite it. Some nights, after returning home, he removed the mask slowly, letting the cool evening air touch his face again. The sensation was always startling, like awakening from a dream, and in that moment, he felt human again. Yet each morning, he put the mask back on without hesitation, not because he trusted it entirely, but because others trusted him. Section 7. Inside the Plague Doctor's Handbook. Strange treatments, hopeful experiments, and unlikely remedies. Before the Plague Doctor ever stepped into a sick room, he often spent hours studying his worn, leather-bound handbook, a collection of remedies gathered from physicians, scholars, travelers, and even local healers. These pages were filled with a strange mixture of wisdom and superstition, brilliant observations, and misguided conclusions. Yet, in the midst of uncertainty, the doctor held onto these writings as if they were gentle lanterns illuminating a path through the darkness. He would turn each page with care, noting the delicate ink strokes, the faded diagrams, and the smudged annotations made by countless hands before him. The handbook felt alive, changing slightly each time he read it, revealing new details or forgotten lines. And surprisingly, its contents were far more varied and imaginative than one might expect. In those days, medicine was not a strict science, but a fluid tapestry woven from philosophy, observation, and cultural tradition. The doctor understood that he was not just treating bodies, but navigating beliefs. Each remedy was not merely physical, it carried emotional weight, offering patients a sense of participation in their own healing. The first pages dealt with what physicians of the time believed to be the root cause of illness, the imbalance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. According to this view, health was harmony, and sickness was disharmony. The plague, they believed, disrupted these inner elements violently. The doctor would spend long nights pondering this theory. He imagined the humors swirling inside the body like a stormy sea, and he wondered whether fear and grief affected them as much as physical exposure. He wrote his own thoughts in the margins, soft reflections rather than instructions. But the handbook also offered practical guidance. Some remedies, though primitive, contained a quiet logic. For example, vinegar appeared repeatedly in the text. Some healers recommended washing hands, tools, and clothing with it. Others suggested soaking sponges in vinegar and placing them near the patient's bed. The doctor appreciated vinegar for its sharp scent and cleansing feel. It felt like an ally, a small force of purity against the unseen threat. Then there were the aromatic therapies. Bundles of herbs, sage, rue, thyme, lavender, were burned in sick rooms to purify the air. While the doctor knew these herbs could not stop the plague outright, he recognized that their fragrances brought a sense of comfort to frightened families. The scent transformed the heavy, anxious atmosphere of a home into something warmer and gentler, even if only briefly. Another intriguing remedy involved placing flowers or citrus fruits around the room. In a time when decay and illness were everywhere, the bright colors and sweet smells acted like emotional medicine, reminding people of nature's cycles and of life beyond disease. The doctor often carried small sprigs of rosemary to offer to children, something to hold, to smell, to calm their trembling hands. Yet the handbook also contained treatments that were far stranger and sometimes unsettling. One section described the practice of using gemstones and minerals: an amethyst worn on a necklace, a polished sapphire placed under a pillow, or a pearl dissolved in vinegar and consumed. All were believed to protect the body or draw out impurities. The doctor did not fully trust these suggestions, but he noticed how patients felt safer when such items were used. Fear diminished a little, and the mind relaxed. Perhaps that alone brought some measure of relief. Another remedy involved placing live toads near the patient based on the belief that the toad would draw out the poison. The doctor quietly avoided this method, feeling it caused more distress than comfort. Instead, he relied on remedies that nurtured the spirit rather than startled it. The handbook also mentioned bloodletting, a common practice of the time, but the doctor approached this method with great caution. He believed excessive bleeding weakened the already fragile. Instead, he focused on gentler interventions: warm compresses, herbal teas, and rest. He often wrote small notes reminding himself, "Do no harm. Offer what strength you can." One of the most peculiar remedies in the handbook was the use of sweet-smelling pomanders. hollow spheres filled with herbs, spices, and resins. People wore them on chains or belts, hoping they would filter the air. The doctor appreciated their presence, not because he believed in their full protective power, but because patients found joy in crafting them. The act of creating something beautiful during a time of chaos gave them a sense of agency. The handbook also presented recipes for plague water, a medicinal mixture made from herbs steeped in alcohol. Though its effectiveness was uncertain, its warmth, when sipped, brought comfort to aching bodies. The doctor learned that sometimes the greatest healing came not from curing a disease, but from easing fear and restoring small moments of peace. Beyond remedies, the handbook contained philosophical passages. One page encouraged physicians to observe the seasons, winds, and stars, believing that environmental forces shaped human health. The doctor found these writings poetic rather than practical, but he enjoyed the idea that medicine connected the earth, sky, and human experience. Another passage reminded healers to protect their own spirit. It suggested moments of quiet reflection, the practice of steady breathing, and maintaining inner balance. These lines stayed with the doctor. They felt like gentle advice from physicians across generations, and in the darkest nights, he read them again and again. Not all remedies were physical. Many pages emphasized the importance of listening, truly listening to the sick, to their stories, fears, regrets, and hopes. The handbook described the physician not only as a healer of bodies, but as a companion in suffering. The doctor embraced this role deeply. Sometimes, a soft conversation at a bedside did more than any herb or tonic. He added his own observations to the margins over the years. He wrote about the healing power of calm voices, the comfort found in familiar objects, the way a patient relaxed when their hand was gently held. He noted that the human heart responded to warmth, even when the body was failing. In this way, his handbook became a living document, a blend of old wisdom and new insight. And through it, he developed a form of healing that blended knowledge with compassion, structure with intuition. It was imperfect, yes, but it was sincere. And in an age of fear, sincerity mattered more than certainty. Section 8. A City Behind Masks. Life, Fear, and Quiet Resilience in the Shadow of the Plague. When the plague doctor stepped out of a patient's home, he entered a world that had transformed beyond recognition. Streets, once filled with merchants, laughter, and the rhythm of everyday life, were now quiet, as if the city itself held its breath. The sunlight felt softer, muted by dust in the air. Windows were shuttered, doors were marked with symbols of warning, prayers of protection, or simple requests for help. Every corner carried an uneasy stillness. Yet beneath this silence, life continued in subdued, altered forms. The doctor walked these streets often, not only to reach his patients, but to understand the pulse of the city. He knew that healing extended beyond the sick rows. It lived in the resilience of families, the endurance of communities, and the small acts of care shared between neighbors. And so, he observed everything with thoughtful attention, as if each detail revealed another layer of the human spirit. One of the first things he noticed was how people's faces had disappeared behind cloths, scarves, or pieces of linen soaked in herbs. These coverings gave the city an air of anonymity. Only the eyes remained visible, startled, hopeful, exhausted, determined. The plague doctor felt a strange kinship with them. His own mask, long-beaked and unsettling, was meant to protect him, yet it also separated him from others. Sometimes he wondered whether the mask shielded his emotions as much as his body. Still, he sensed that the people behind their makeshift coverings were connected by a shared understanding. Everyone was vulnerable, and everyone relied on one another more than ever. Along the edges of the market square, a few vendors remained. They stood behind tables sparsely lined with bread, onions, or wilted vegetables. The doctor watched as buyers approached cautiously, placing coins in bowls of vinegar to sanitize them before exchanging goods. There was a quiet choreography to their movements, measured steps, careful touches, gentle nods. It was as though the entire city had agreed to speak with gestures instead of voices, so as not to disturb the delicate balance of fear and hope. He often saw children peering out from behind doorways, their eyes curious but hesitant. They seemed to sense that the world had changed, but did not yet know how or why. Some clutched wooden toys close to their chests, whispering stories to comfort themselves. Others drew chalk pictures on the stone walls, flowers, animals, suns with smiling faces, as if trying to remind the city of joy. The doctor always paused near these drawings. Their innocence, their bright colors, felt like soft lanterns glowing in the gloom. He also observed how faith shaped the city's response to the crisis. Bells from churches rang at odd hours, summoning not crowds but distant echoes. Priests moved through the streets offering blessings from afar, raising their hands rather than touching shoulders. Families placed candles in their windows at night, small flickering lights that formed constellations across the darkened city. The doctor found comfort in these rituals, even if his beliefs were rooted more in healing than in prayer. To him, the candles represented something universal, a shared longing for protection, guidance, and the return of normal days. On some evenings, when his work allowed, he climbed a set of stone steps that led to an overlook above the rooftops. From there, he could see the city spread out like a patchwork quilt, stitched together by narrow alleys and open squares. Smoke curled from chimneys. Cats wandered freely, claiming empty spaces as their kingdom. A few figures moved slowly along pathways, carrying water or tending small gardens. The city was quiet, yes, but not dead. There was a pulse, gentle, persistent, almost rhythmic. A quiet resilience that whispered through every shuttered home. The doctor reflected often on how people supported one another. He witnessed neighbors leaving bundles of bread at the doorsteps of those too weak to shop. He saw women hanging baskets from windows with ropes so that passers-by could leave food or messages. He noticed how men drew clean water from public wells, not only for their own households, but for 3 or 4 others. Sometimes the doctor himself participated. On his way to a patient, he would carry a small loaf of bread, a sprig of herbs, or a folded note offering reassurance. Though he rarely revealed his presence, he left these gifts quietly at doors where he sensed fear was strongest. He believed that restoring hope, even anonymously, was part of his duty. He also witnessed sorrow, deep and unavoidable. Families standing in doorways as loved ones were carried away, unable to hold them or say proper farewells. Streets where black flags fluttered from too many windows. Workers transporting bodies with solemn efficiency, their faces hidden behind cloths soaked in wine or vinegar. The doctor felt these losses heavily. They formed a weight in his chest that grew over time. But he did not let the sorrow close him off. Instead, he folded it into himself as a reminder of why he continued, why he walked these streets, entered these homes, faced the risks. He wanted to be a small force of steadiness in a world that trembled. There were moments, however, when the city revealed glimpses of unexpected beauty. A musician who stood at his window each evening, playing soft melodies on a lute to comfort the neighborhood. A baker who continued making sweet pastries on Sundays so children would have something delightful to look forward to. A group of friends who sang quietly from separate windows, their harmonies drifting through the air like warm threads weaving across the empty square. These were the moments that moved the doctor most. They reminded him that even in fear, people sought connection, even in hardship. They created small offerings of light. He noticed how nature slowly reclaimed pieces of the city. Grass sprouted between cobblestones. Birds nested in quiet alleyways. Trees blossomed untouched by human activity. In this strange stillness, the natural world grew bolder, filling the spaces left by daily commotion. At times, the doctor paused to watch the way sunlight filtered between buildings, illuminating dust particles that danced like tiny stars. The peacefulness of these scenes contrasted sharply with the suffering he witnessed inside homes. But that contrast also reminded him that life was layered, complex, and resilient. As he continued his daily rounds, he realized that the city behind the masks was not defined solely by fear, but by adaptability. people found new ways to live, to support each other, to maintain a sense of identity. The city had not surrendered. It had simply grown quieter, more deliberate, more aware of the fragile threads that connected all who lived within its walls. And in those threads, he saw hope. Hope quiet enough to be missed if one moved too quickly. Hope soft enough to be felt only by those who paid attention. But hope all the same. Section 9. Within the sick room, a doctor's quiet rituals of care. When the plague doctor entered a home, the world outside slipped away, as though someone had closed a door between two entirely different realities. The city's muted sounds faded, replaced by the hush of rooms where people lay caught between fevered dreams and fragile breaths. Inside these dim, candlelit spaces, time slowed to a pace measured not by the hour, but by the rise and fall of a patient's chest. Each sick room had its own atmosphere, shaped by the family that lived there, by the severity of the illness, and by the quiet hope that clung stubbornly to even the darkest corners. The doctor moved through them with deliberate gentleness, aware that the smallest sound, a boot scraping the floor, the rustle of his cloak, could disturb the delicate peace that illness imposed. His rituals began at the door. Before entering, he always paused. It was not hesitation, but a moment of preparation, a breath to steady his thoughts. He believed that calmness, even unseen behind his mask, could influence those he treated. After all, a healer's presence was as much a tool as herbs or poultices, and so he gathered himself, allowing the weight of responsibility to settle into clarity rather than burden. Then he stepped inside. The air was often thick with a mixture of scents: fever sweat, boiled water, the sharpness of vinegar. The earthy aroma of herbs hung from beams or stuffed into pillows. Candles flickered softly, their golden light illuminating faces that bore the unmistakable signs of the plague: swollen glands, flushed skin, or the trembling shivers that accompanied the early stages of the illness. Families usually greeted him with a mixture of relief and fear. They stepped back to give him space, unable to do more than watch as he approached the patient. Some wrung their hands. Others whispered prayers under their breath. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, wide-eyed, unsure whether the strange figure in the long coat had come to save or to confirm their worst fears. The doctor always offered a small gesture of reassurance, a nod, a raised hand, a slow breath deliberately taken to show composure. He could not show his face, but he could show intention. His examination of the patient was quiet, methodical. He checked the pulse, noting whether it throbbed with fever or weakened with exhaustion. He placed a gloved hand gently on the forehead, feeling for heat. He listened to the breath. Was it shallow, labored, intermittent? These details, invisible to most, guided his next steps. Often, he spoke to the patient in a low voice, even if they could not respond. Words, he believed, had a soothing power. He described what he was doing, told them to rest, reminded them that they were not alone. He avoided giving false hope, but he did offer comfort, which he felt was just as important as treatment. Families watched him closely. They searched for clues in the tilt of his head or the way he leaned over the patient. Hope and despair hung in the air together, as fragile as the thin smoke rising from a candle. Once he finished his examination, he opened the small leather bag he carried. Inside was a modest collection of remedies, bundles of herbs tied with string, small vials of vinegar or tincture, linen strips, and sometimes objects meant more to calm the mind than cure the body. He knew that these treatments were imperfect, but he also understood that healing involved more than the physical. Belief, he found, was often a powerful companion to medicine. He might grind dried flowers into a powder and dissolve them in warm water for the patient to sip, or he might place a cool cloth soaked in herbal infusion on their forehead. Sometimes he applied poultices to swollen glands, hoping to lessen the pain or draw out the illness. At other times, he simply adjusted the linens, opened a window to allow fresh air to enter, or urged the family to speak softly so the patient could rest peacefully. There were moments in these rooms that stayed with him long after he left. The whispered gratitude of a mother whose child finally slept without coughing. The trembling hand of an elderly man reaching out from beneath his blanket, not for medicine, but for reassurance. The way a young girl placed a small wooden doll on her sister's pillow, as if to guard her dreams. He carried these moments with him, storing them silently in the chambers of his mind. They reminded him that even in illness, tenderness endured. There were difficult moments too, times when the illness had progressed too far. When the patient's breaths came in ragged gasps, or when their eyes stared past him with a distant, clouded look. In these times, the room felt unbearably small. The air grew heavy with unspoken grief. Families wept quietly in corners, unable to touch their loved one, but unable to look away. The doctor stayed with them as long as he could. He offered what comfort he could give. If the time came, he closed the patient's eyes with a reverence that no one expected but everyone appreciated. He always paused before covering the body, letting the family see that he honored the life that had just slipped away. Then, with the same gentle composure he carried into the room, he offered soft instructions on what would happen next. His voice remained calm, even when the grief around him swelled like a breaking wave. He knew that families needed steadiness in these moments. Something solid to hold on to. Afterward, he stepped outside the home, removing his gloves and treating them with vinegar before leaving. The air outside felt colder, almost startling after the warmth of the sick room. He often lingered on the street for a moment, allowing the emotional weight to settle. He did not rush to erase it. He let himself feel it, then folded it away so he could continue. For each home he left, another waited. Each door he approached was another story. Another fragile hope, another battle unfolding quietly behind closed walls. And so he continued his rituals, patient after patient, day after day, guided by a sense of duty that did not falter. He understood something profound. Even when he could not cure, he could care. And sometimes, care itself was a kind of healing. Section 10. The Plague Doctor's Unseen Observations. Beyond the bedside rituals and the carefully measured poultices, the Plague Doctor carried another set of responsibilities. Observations that no one else noticed, or if they did, hardly understood. The streets, alleys, and homes of the city were a living archive of the disease, and he, with his unique vantage, moved through it like a quiet witness, recording details that others overlooked. Every gesture, every symptom, every pattern of illness contributed to an invisible map he traced in his mind, one that attempted to understand the chaos in its entirety. In the quiet moments between calls, when a patient rested or a family moved about their day, he would pause to take note. How did the sickness progress in different neighborhoods? Were certain homes warmer or colder than others? Did the size of a room or the number of people sharing a space influence the spread? Every small detail mattered, and though the answers were never complete, they offered glimpses of the invisible threads that connected the city, the illness, and its victims. He was attentive to the rhythm of the streets themselves. Early in the morning, the fog clung to the cobblestones, softening sounds and light, making each movement seem slower, more deliberate. Vendors called out their wares, but their voices carried with a cautious distance, aware that proximity to anyone coughing could be dangerous. Children, wide-eyed and quiet, sometimes trailed behind parents or siblings, learning at an early age the silent codes of survival. Every cough, every whisper, every hurried step was data to him. Observations recorded not in ink, but in memory, stored for reflection later. Inside homes, his gaze extended beyond the patient. He noted the arrangement of furniture, the placement of beds, the flow of air through windows and doors. He observed how families interacted. Some hovered anxiously near the sick, while others retreated to corners, giving space yet lingering in worry. These social dynamics, he believed, were as important as any medicinal treatment. Fear and tension could spread almost as quickly as the disease, and a calm presence, he realized, might slow its toll on the mind, if not the body. The doctor also observed the emotional landscape of each house. Grief, hope, fatigue, and relief were all tangible forces. He recognized the signs of psychological exhaustion: the family member who spoke less, the child who stopped playing, the parent who avoided looking at the patient directly. These, he understood, were not minor details. They were part of the fabric of survival. Caring for the mind was intertwined with caring for the body. He sometimes offered words meant solely for the watchers: quiet encouragement, reminders to breathe, or simple statements of empathy. Though subtle, these gestures were carefully measured. Even when the patient could not hear, the atmosphere of calm could ripple through a room, sometimes enough to ease tension that had been building for days. He also paid attention to the small domestic practices that seemed to influence outcomes. Certain families kept windows open despite cold weather, allowing the air to circulate. Others used incense or vinegar-soaked cloths to purify the room, not fully understanding why, but intuitively following habits that reduced risk. Some prepared herbal teas or applied compresses according to long-standing tradition. The doctor silently cataloged these practices, noting which had subtle benefits, which were purely ritual, and which were ineffective or even harmful. Every observation contributed to a growing understanding, a mental ledger of human ingenuity and adaptation in the face of overwhelming odds. The paths the doctor took through the city were deliberate. He sometimes avoided streets crowded with panicked citizens, choosing instead narrow alleys where he could observe without interference. Other times, he moved through marketplaces, noticing who was absent, those too sick to leave home, and who persisted despite illness. Their endurance a testament to resilience, or sometimes stubbornness. Each observation offered a piece of a puzzle larger than any single household. In addition, he watched the effects of weather on illness. Rain seemed to dampen the spread, or at least make movement slower, limiting contact. Cold, dry days, on the other hand, forced people closer to stoves and each other, and the risk of transmission appeared higher. Fog softened the sounds of the city, but also concealed its dangers. In all of this, the doctor learned to read the invisible currents of life, movement, and illness, seeing patterns that were otherwise imperceptible. He recorded these insights in small, hidden notebooks, using symbols and shorthand only he could interpret. They were private, never meant for others, yet each note was a reflection of careful attention to the rhythms of the world during the plague. Here was a record not just of illness, but of resilience, ingenuity, grief, and hope, a testament to the quiet ways people adapted to the unimaginable. Perhaps most importantly, the doctor recognized that his observations were incomplete. The illness was capricious, shifting, and at times cruelly unpredictable. He could not control the larger patterns of disease, but he could respond thoughtfully to what he did see. He understood that medicine, like observation, was a combination of skill, intuition, and patience. Every step, every touch, every carefully measured word contributed to a balance between chaos and order, life and death. And in the quiet of the night, when the last candle burned low and the city seemed to hold its breath, he often reflected on what he had seen. The footprints of illness and resilience intertwined, forming an invisible map of human indolence. Each home he visited, each life he touched, left an impression, not always permanent, but meaningful nonetheless. In these moments of reflection, he realized that being a plague doctor was as much about witnessing as curing, about understanding as treating. And perhaps, in this act of attentive observation, he preserved something just as vital as medicine: the human story, the silent struggles, and the small, courageous acts that sustained life even when death seemed so close. Section 11. The plague doctor's secret networks. While much of a plague doctor's work took place within homes, the streets, and the sick rooms, there existed another layer of his life, one hidden from the casual observer. He was not alone in his efforts. Across the city, other doctors, healers, herbalists, and even those who dealt in simple remedies formed a network that operated quietly, almost invisibly. They shared information, advice, and occasionally supplies, understanding that collaboration could save lives, even if it could not prevent death entirely. The doctor's role in this network was as a conduit, a link between observation and action, translating the raw data of illness into practical knowledge. This network was not organized like a guild or a formal institution. There were no official meetings, no charts on walls, no bureaucratic structure. Instead, it functioned through letters, discreet visits, and subtle signs. A particular knock on a door, a specific phrase exchanged in the marketplace, or a careful note left in a predetermined spot could communicate information quickly and efficiently without alerting those who might react with panic. It was a system based on trust, shared experience, and the understanding that secrecy was as important as skill. The plague doctor often carried a small satchel, not only with medical tools, but also with messages, samples, and records intended for other members of the network. He would exchange a vial of herbs for observations made by a colleague, compare notes on patient progress, and discuss patterns of the disease as they emerged across the city. Each piece of information added depth to the collective understanding, though always filtered through caution. In a world gripped by fear, a wrong word could cause chaos, spreading panic faster than the illness itself. One of the remarkable aspects of this network was its subtle intelligence. Observations were often indirect, gathered through intermediaries. A washerwoman might note which streets were unusually quiet. A shopkeeper might observe who was absent from the market, and a neighbor might report patterns of coughing or fever in nearby houses. These seemingly minor details were passed along carefully, giving the plague doctor a mosaic of the city's condition without requiring him to be everywhere at once. The network functioned as a living map of illness, one that constantly shifted and adapted with each day. The doctor also observed how human behavior influenced the effectiveness of treatments and interventions. Families who followed guidance from trusted members of the network often fared better, maintaining sanitation practices, isolation protocols, and simple health routines that mitigated the spread of infection. Others, perhaps skeptical or fearful, resisted advice, unknowingly placing themselves and their neighbors at greater risk. The network allowed the doctor to identify these variations, to provide targeted guidance, and to influence behavior indirectly without confrontation. It was an early form of public health strategy, intuitive and responsive to social dynamics. Communication within the network relied heavily on empathy and discretion. Letters were written in code or vague language, avoiding specifics that could alarm those who might intercept them. Visits were timed and orchestrated to minimize risk. Even verbal exchanges in the streets were guarded, using metaphor and innuendo to convey meaning while protecting both sender and recipient. In many ways, the network was a social experiment as much as a medical one, testing how information could flow under extreme stress and fear, and how trust could be maintained in a fragile environment. The network's reach extended beyond the city itself. Traders, travelers, and even distant villages contributed information, allowing the plague doctor to track the movement of illness across regions. He learned to correlate environmental factors, social patterns, and mobility with the spread of disease, piecing together an understanding of contagion long before germ theory existed. His observations formed a tapestry of human life under duress, one thread at a time, woven through connections that were subtle, decentralized, and astonishingly effective given the limitations of the era. The emotional support within the network was equally important. Doctors and healers, despite their training and experience, were human. Witnessing death day after day, sometimes in vast numbers, was exhausting and demoralizing. Within the network, they could share their fears, seek reassurance, and offer guidance to one another. These small interactions, words of encouragement, the silent nod of recognition, the simple act of listening, helped maintain the resilience of those who bore the heaviest burdens of the epidemic. In this sense, the network was not only practical, but also profoundly human, sustaining morale in the face of relentless loss. The plague doctor's participation in the network shaped his understanding of mortality and human endurance. He saw firsthand the extremes of fear and hope, despair and courage. The city, under siege by illness, revealed the duality of human nature. Some acted selfishly, hoarding resources or ignoring advice, while others demonstrated remarkable altruism, caring for the sick at personal risk. Every interaction, every exchange within the network, provided insight into these dynamics, creating a comprehensive picture of life during the plague. Despite the immense challenges, the network persisted, evolving as the epidemic waxed and waned. The plague doctor adapted his methods based on the collective intelligence of his colleagues, integrating new observations, experimenting with remedies, and refining isolation techniques. The network was a living entity, resilient and responsive, capable of sustaining knowledge in a way that no single individual could. It was, in many ways, a precursor to modern systems of epidemiology and public health, driven by human connection, observation, and careful stewardship of information. In quiet moments, when he finally rested, the plague doctor reflected on the significance of this unseen web. It was not the fame of discoveries, the grandeur of cures, or the recognition of peers that mattered most. It was the quiet persistence of observation, communication, and compassion, the invisible network that allowed human life to endure in the shadow of catastrophe. Each message passed, each note recorded, each subtle act of guidance contributed to the survival of countless families and the preservation of knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. It was a testament to ingenuity, empathy, and the human capacity to collaborate, even in the darkest of times. Section 12, The Plague Doctor's Final Lessons. As the years passed, the plague doctor accumulated knowledge that went far beyond what any single treatment could achieve. He came to understand patterns in disease, human behavior, and city life that were subtle yet profound. Each epidemic left traces, not only in the bodies of the afflicted, but also in the collective psyche of the city. He noticed how fear could spread faster than illness, how isolation could save lives when applied judiciously, and how even small gestures of care could ripple outward to impact entire neighborhoods. These observations became his final lessons, ones that would outlast individual outbreaks and continue to influence medicine and society long after he laid down his instruments. One of the most important lessons he recorded was the delicate balance between intervention and restraint. The doctor realized that forcing remedies upon those unwilling to accept them often caused more harm than good. He learned to observe, listen, and guide gently, allowing families to participate actively in the care of their own loved ones. He discovered that trust was a crucial element in combating disease. The moment it was broken, even the most effective treatment became useless. This understanding shaped his approach, emphasizing patience, empathy, and respect for human autonomy as much as the remedies themselves. The doctor also reflected deeply on the role of fear. During the plague, fear was both a natural response and a dangerous force. He noticed that panic often led to rash decisions, overcrowding in certain areas and neglect in others. Those who succumbed to despair sometimes abandoned their homes or fled the city, inadvertently carrying disease with them. Conversely, a calm, informed population was more likely to adhere to sanitation measures, follow advice, and care for one another. Over time, the doctor became as much a teacher and counselor as a healer, using his presence and knowledge to guide the community through the emotional as well as the physical challenges of epidemic life. Observation became the doctor's most reliable tool. He meticulously recorded the timing, progression, and outcomes of illness, noting correlations with diet, environment, and social activity. He marked seasonal trends, patterns of clustering in households, and the impact of local infrastructure on the spread of disease. Each detail, no matter how small, contributed to a larger understanding of the city's vulnerabilities and strengths. Over years, these records formed a kind of manual for epidemic management, a blend of science, human insight, and practical wisdom that would influence generations of practitioners long before modern epidemiology emerged. The doctor also examined the limitations of his own knowledge. He understood that despite all his training and observation, death remained an inevitable companion in the plague years. He saw brilliant minds succumb alongside the poor, and the frail survive against overwhelming odds. This recognition of uncertainty shaped his humility, guiding him to avoid overconfidence and embrace cautious experimentation. He learned that medicine was as much about mitigating suffering as it was about curing disease, and that sometimes the most valuable interventions were those that offered comfort, reassurance, and dignity rather than a cure. Interconnected with these lessons was the doctor's understanding of community resilience. He observed that neighborhoods with strong social bonds, shared resources, and cooperative behavior fared better during epidemics than isolated or fragmented areas. Mutual aid networks, informal watch systems, and shared caregiving were as critical to survival as any medicinal intervention. The doctor's role extended beyond treating individual patients to nurturing the social structures that allowed the city to endure. In this way, his work was as much about sociology and ethics as it was about medicine, a recognition that health could not exist in isolation from society. Even in his final years, the doctor continued to experiment carefully with remedies and protective measures. He refined the design of his beak mask, tested variations in herb mixtures, and explored new methods of disinfecting clothing and dwellings. He consulted with colleagues across the city and beyond, exchanging letters and samples to expand his knowledge base. Each small success or failure was meticulously recorded, adding to a growing body of empirical evidence. Though primitive by modern standards, these methods demonstrated remarkable ingenuity and adaptability, revealing a mind tirelessly engaged in learning and discovery. Above all, the plague doctor's final reflections were imbued with humanity. He understood that the story of the epidemic was not merely a story of disease, but a story of people, their courage, their compassion, their mistakes, and their resilience. He wrote of the nurse who stayed with her sick neighbors at personal risk, the child who brought water to ailing relatives, the families who sacrificed comfort to protect the vulnerable. These accounts, woven through with detail and observation, became a testament to the enduring spirit of human life under extreme adversity. In many ways, they were as important as his medical notes, providing guidance for future generations in both science and morality. In the quiet moments of reflection, the doctor also pondered the role of memory and record-keeping. He knew that the city's experience with the plague would fade from immediate memory as survivors rebuilt their lives, and that knowledge could be lost if not carefully documented. He kept journals, diagrams, and coded notes, intending them for those who would come after him. He hoped that future practitioners would learn not only from his remedies, but from his observations of human behavior, community dynamics, and the subtle interplay of fear, hope, and perseverance. His work was as much a gift to posterity as it was a response to immediate suffering. Ultimately, the plague doctor's final lessons were a blend of science, empathy, and philosophy. He demonstrated that effective medicine required careful observation, patience, and respect for human dignity. He showed that survival depended not only on treatments, but also on community cohesion, trust, and the thoughtful management of fear. And he left a record of human endurance in the face of mortality, a guide for those who would encounter future crises. The city, scarred yet resilient, bore witness to his quiet legacy, one that transcended individual lives and spoke to the enduring capacity of knowledge and compassion to shape history.